What is art without the muse? Many of art history's most famous works are depictions of women. But who were these women? Do they have their own stories to share with the world? Hello, I'm Grace Anna, host of Art Muse, a podcast that aims to reshape the ways in which we interpret well-known works of art by paying dues to the women whose images have been immortalized, but whose names and stories have been wrongfully overlooked. While these women's faces are familiar to viewers around the world, their identities have been largely forgotten. Each episode of Art Muse focuses our attention on the female muse, sharing their lives and important legacy. Together, we will appreciate these works of art from a new perspective, through the eyes of the women whose image stares back at us. Art Muse is available for streaming on all listening platforms. We look forward to sharing with you the life stories of the women behind some of the world's most important works of art.
Hello, listeners! Welcome to Stars of the Golden Age, a show that highlights the lives of legends from film, music, and the birth of television during Hollywood's golden age and the few years surrounding it. I am your host, Erin Carlson. As we continue to respect Black History Month and remember the pain and triumphs that were made in our nation's past, I have the story of one more remarkable Black American to share with you today. I want to remind everyone that we should always respect and remember Black history in America. But this month, I definitely wanted to highlight some special individuals who contributed so much to history. You'll still see diversity in my stories, well, as much as possible, as you know, there really wasn't much in old Hollywood. But I have Sammy Davis Jr. on my list, as well as Sidney Portier, Lena Horne, Ethel Waters, James Edwards, Dorothy Dandridge, Freddie Washington, Harry Belafonte, and Stephen Fetchit. So please let me know if I'm forgetting anyone, and I will get them added to my list. But for today, we are going to learn all about the amazing and uber-talented Paul Robeson. What a remarkable human that man was. My main source for this episode was a book written by Paul Robeson's son. It's called The Undiscovered Paul Robeson, An Artist's Journey by Paul Robeson Jr. Let's dive right in. We have a lot to cover. Paul Leroy Robeson was born in Princeton, New Jersey on April 9, 1898. Actually, I want to read to you what his son wrote in the opening line of his book about his father. It's just a really beautiful passage. He wrote, "Paul Leroy Robeson's soul as an artist was formed in a journey through life that began on April 9, 1898. Isn't that just a beautiful way to begin his father's story? Paul's parents were a little on the older side when he was born on that April day in 1898. His mother, Maria, was 45 years old when he was born, and his father, William, was 54. That's dang near elderly in 1898. We wouldn't blink an eye at that today. I mean, Al Pacino became a father again in 2023 at the age of 84. That child's mother was 29, so think what you will about that. So today, we old people have kids all the time. I can say that because I'm almost 45 myself. But in 1898, that was pretty old to be having children. Paul was the seventh child for William and Maria. Sadly, two of their children had died when they were infants, a sadly common occurrence in those days. The oldest of the Robeson children was 17 years old when little Paul was born. William Robeson was a Presbyterian pastor. His parents had both been slaves, and William himself spent his first part of his life in slavery too. He and his brother actually escaped on the Underground Railroad when William was 15 years old, yet he rarely spoke of his experience in slavery. He wanted to put those horrors in his past and focus on the present and future of his family. William was a reserved and serious man, something he would pass down to his youngest son, and he expected excellence from all of his children. Maria, of course, held the career of wife and mother. And boy, did she have her hands full with all those children. She did, however, used to work as a teacher. It was also noted that she was partially blind and suffered from debilitating asthma. Maria was a bright and happy woman despite those medical hardships. A horrible tragedy occurred on the morning of July 19, 1904, when Paul was 5 years old. William was out of town for the day, and 12-year-old Ben was helping his mother with some household chores and cleaning while the other children were at school. He too should have been in school, but William had asked him to stay home and help Maria since her eyesight had gotten pretty bad by this point. It is thought that even the youngest, Paul, was home that day, but nobody can quite remember after the events that took place. As Maria and Ben were cleaning the family's home, Maria wanted to clean the rug in the living area. Their wood stove sat on a portion of the rug, and she wanted to clean under the stove. But the stove had been burning that morning and still had hot coals in it. You can probably see where this is going, so if you are sensitive to details of severe injuries, you might want to skip ahead 30 seconds. Ben lifted the wood stove while Maria attempted to pull the rug out from under the stove. Well, as he did that, the door on the front of the stove opened while it was being maneuvered, and hot coals fell out and immediately set Maria's dress on fire. As the fire quickly spread on Maria's body, Ben ran to the neighbors for help. The two of them were able to extinguish the flames on Maria's clothing, hair, and body, but she had been very, very badly burned. A doctor arrived and was able to help ease her pain a little. But remember, it was 1904, and burns are just excruciatingly painful. Her feet, legs, and hands were horribly burned, and half of her hair had been burned off. Worse yet, she had actually inhaled flames. And remember, she has debilitating asthma. Her lungs were already weakened. She was in unimaginable pain. William returned that evening to learn of the horrific accident that happened in his absence. The pain was too much to endure for Maria, and she could barely breathe. Her family said tearful goodbyes to their wife and mother, and then a doctor gave Maria a heavy dose of opiates. She fell into unconsciousness, and she died. Paul Robeson was left without a mother at just 5 years old. Paul recalled as an adult that he had no memory of his mother at all or coming home from school that day to the tragic experience. His brother, who was home, has a sliver of a memory of the horrific event of 5-year-old Paul in the doorway as his mother's body was engulfed in flames. Either way, Paul had no memories of his mother, but he had vivid memories of experiences prior to her death, just not with her in it. Most likely, the tragedy was so unbearable that his mind went into survival mode. His mind was saving him from the anguish of this loss. And remember, he was 5 years old. His brain was in peak development. This kind of psychological trauma response is called dissociative amnesia. A traumatic childhood experience physically changes the direction in which the developing brain is being formed. The portions of the brain that control emotional regulation, primarily the hippocampus, can be deeply affected by trauma. Basically, the brain puts up defenses within itself to protect a person from psychological harm. Today, a child would likely immediately begin intensive therapy to help navigate the deep emotional effect such a traumatic experience would create. But not so much in 1904. And remember, William Robeson was an emotionally detached man. So these poor children were really left in a difficult position after losing their mother in such a horrific way. Within 3 years of Maria's death, all of the elder Robeson children were out of the house, and just Paul and his father were left. William Robeson was 62 years old, and Paul was 8. This actually was a time of great blessing for Paul and his father. They became very, very close, and William instilled positive values in his son. He spent hours working with him academically to make sure he was as cognitively ready for the world as he could be. He taught him how to give back to his community, how to be kind and respectful to others, and he sadly taught him how to survive in a deeply racist country. The truth of it was, the better you could present yourself to white people, the easier your time would be as a black person. In high school, Paul was one of only 12 black students in a school of 200 kids. But Paul was pretty well accepted thanks to his near-perfect academic success, his well-trained social etiquette, and his great athletic ability. Paul played football, baseball, and basketball and was excellent at all. And he was a good singer. He became a soloist in the school glee club, which the music teacher had to fight for because the principal was a huge racist. Paul was a good kid. He was studious, courteous, and talented in pretty much everything he tried. But circling back to that earlier childhood trauma, I'm going to quote a passage from his son's book about him. He said, quote, "All of the internal tensions he felt at school and at home, he learned to curb. So it was rarely apparent to anyone that he suppressed a violent temper," end quote. He had a rage festering inside of him that he was able to bury deep, deep down, which isn't healthy and can be very dangerous. One of the many psychological side effects of an untreated emotional trauma in early childhood years. He did have an outlet for some of that pent-up frustration and anger, though. Football. He was a monster on the field. I'm not sure how many other black teenagers were on Paul's high school football team. I'm guessing not many. But there was a story about a game Paul was playing fullback in where the refs looked the other way as the opposing team's defense pummeled him on the field. He walked away from that game with a broken nose and a broken collarbone. The reason those adult men who were reffing the game allowed a child to get brutally beaten during a school sporting event with bleachers full of people watching was because he was black. During his senior year, Paul entered an academic competition in which the winning student would receive a full 4-year scholarship to Rutgers College, which at the time was an all-male, all-white college. This contest was open to every high school senior in the whole state of New Jersey. And the winner of that scholarship to the esteemed Rutgers was Paul Robeson. When Paul arrived at Rutgers in the fall of 1915, he was only the 3rd black student in history to attend the college. But he couldn't live in the dorms. Why not? Because he was the only black student enrolled at the time, so there was no one he could room with. Yeah. Paul's 4 years at Rutgers were very difficult. He was a complete outcast and victim of pure hostility because of the color of his skin. He was smart, articulate, kind, compassionate, and a very talented athlete. But none of that mattered, because he was black. He did find some solid friendships in the upper-class black community nearby, though. He wasn't from an upper class, far from, but he was handsome and carried himself very well. And that can get you a long way. Paul worked at a hotel during the summers, and then something wonderful happened when he returned for his sophomore year at Rutgers. Another black student had been accepted. So now there were 2 black students on the student roster, and Paul could finally live on campus because there was another black person to share the dorm with. Isn't that sad? It's all so sad. Paul was a huge asset on the football team at Rutgers, but the administration and his teammates made it really difficult for him to be on the team. His coach, thankfully, was kind and supportive to him and took him under his wing. But his teammates physically assaulted him on the field during scrimmages whenever possible. His own teammates. And the administration forced him to stay out of some away games to prevent controversy. And of course, his locker was set far away from the other players in the locker room. Imagine living through these struggles on a daily basis in every single aspect of your life. That was the reality for pretty much every black citizen of our country. Paul played football, baseball, basketball, and was in swimming, track, and choir. And he maintained a B average academically. All while dealing with the daily realities of racism and having exactly 1 friend on the entire Rutgers campus because of the color of his skin. Like I said, he was forced off the field at some of his football games, including the homecoming game. He was also invited to sing at prom because he had a beautiful voice, but not actually attend prom. He was urged to join the glee club, but couldn't travel to any of their events with them. And out of all of his sports and extracurriculars, he wasn't welcome at any of the social events associated with them. And then came his junior year. Paul Robeson was 6'3" and 220 pounds of pure muscle when he returned to campus for his third year at Rutgers. His football coach decided it was time to fight for this young man. He was by far the best player on the team, and he fought to break racial lines to allow Paul to be able to play at the away games he was until then barred from. Before long, Robeson of Rutgers was a household name, not only in New Jersey, but across the entire United States. He was the #1 college football player in the entire nation. Paul Robeson was now the campus hero. But dark-skinned heroes were still not welcome at social events. He was beloved by fans while he was on the field, but once it came to mingling outside of the football field, well, we just couldn't have that. Not only that, but he was the leading college football star in the entire United States. Yet his name was not even mentioned as a contender for captain of the Rutgers football team his senior year. Sadly, he wasn't surprised or bothered much by this. He had learned long ago to accept this as the way things were in this white-dominated world that he lived in. It was extremely important to Paul to please his father. Reverend Robeson was a strict father, but in a nurturing way. He expected greatness from his youngest child, the one who had been his partner in life after his wife had died and the others had grown. And Paul delivered that excellence to his father. His father was so proud of him. Nearing the end of his junior year at college, Paul Robeson lost his guiding light, his father, on May 17, 1918. 1 month later, the entire family gathered, and it would be the last time all of the Robeson siblings would be in the same place at the same time. In fact, it was the last time Paul would ever see his brothers Reed and Bill. Paul's father had wanted him to become a minister like he had been, but Paul didn't want that in his future. So they had compromised on law. But now that William was gone and Paul didn't have to put all of his energy into satisfying his father, he could really choose his own future. Paul graduated from Rutgers College on June 18, 1919, and he was asked to give a speech at the commencement ceremony because he was valedictorian. As he walked to the stage, the entire audience rose to applaud him. He had put his all into those 4 years at Rutgers. When most people would have let defeat win, Paul Robeson conquered the hardships and brutality of his experiences and rose to the top. And the best of all, he earned respect. The respect he had deserved all along. The summer of 1919 was known as the Red Summer of 1919 because of the horrific lynchings of innocent Black people and the burning of entire Black communities by white mobs. This was the world Paul Robeson was stepping out into. Paul decided to honor his father by continuing on to law school as William had wanted for him. And his good grades and stellar athletic history at Rutgers earned him a scholarship to NYU Law School. But he felt incredibly out of place there. He dropped out and transferred to Columbia, losing his scholarship in the process. It was that bad. What was really good, though, was his discovery of the Black cultural magic happening in Harlem, and he spent as much time as he could there, right in the midst of the great Harlem Renaissance. This was a time and a place of great artistic enrichment. Writers, musicians, artists, poets, social activists, a rich gathering of wildly artistic and intellectual minds. And Paul loved it. He even starred in a play at the Harlem YMCA. Reluctantly, a friend pretty much forced him to do it. Money was tight, so Paul finally gave in and took the job that he'd been declining, but the money would be great for him. Pro football. He joined the Akron Pros for the 1920 and 1921 seasons, where he earned $500 per game. And with Paul's help on defense, they won the championship title the 1920 season. The tall, muscular, handsome, and intelligent Paul Robeson was also somewhat of a ladies' man. He dated regularly, but there were 2 women in particular who he had his eyes set on for potential marriage material. Jerry Neal and Essie Good. And he really wanted to get married soon. After some emotional back and forth in his own mind, he decided he wanted to marry Jerry. But Jerry knew that Paul was destined for greatness and that he was going to be famous and successful someday, whether it be in football or something else. And she didn't want to live in his shadow. She didn't want to ever come second to the rest of the world. She loved him, but she wouldn't marry him. So Essie it was. Essie was a medical scientist with plans on becoming a physician. That's pretty rad for a black woman in the early 1920s. Paul hustled over to Essie's house, proposed, she said yes, and they took off to get married immediately. But Essie's parents had wanted their daughter to marry within their more upper class, and they also didn't like the fact that Paul was a darker-skinned black man than their family's lighter tone. Too black was definitely a thing within the black community as well, as we've learned from some of our other stories. I don't know, I think Paul sounds like a great catch, but Essie's parents thought otherwise. So the two lovebirds took off and eloped in August of 1921, keeping their marriage a secret for several months. They wouldn't even live together for the first months of their marriage. Once they finally announced their marriage to their families and moved into a single room in a home in Harlem together, they quickly realized that they were pretty opposite and there were some definite growing pains that they had to get through. On top of that, their schedules conflicted greatly, so they barely saw each other. But they made it work. That pushy theater friend came sniffing around again in the spring of 1922, really wanting the tall and handsome Paul to star in another theater production. He had no intention to, since he was busy with law school and a part-time postal job. But his new wife Essie convinced him to defer his studies, quit his job, and be in the play. Her argument was that as a black man, he probably couldn't find great success as a lawyer. But as a black man, he could find great success in the theater. Paul did what his wife said, and he was in the play. And he realized he really enjoyed acting and singing. His pushy theater friend had single-handedly redirected his life. Well, I guess alongside with that little nudge from Essie, who would forever be his guiding light. And he set off in that upward trajectory really quickly. Within a couple months, he was picked for the lead role of a play he'd previously done, but this time on an English tour, ending in London. Pretty big deal. Paul loved England. He loved how much better he was treated than in the US. He loved everything about it, and he wanted Essie to come over too. He wanted them to potentially stay. I don't blame him. I loved my time in the UK, especially London. But Essie had become very ill in his absence and couldn't join him in England, so he returned home. While she was out of work recovering from her illness, Paul decided to do one more season of football. He was signed with the Milwaukee Badgers and was making more money than his couple of seasons with the Akron Pros. That's the main reason he kept returning to the football field. It was really easy money for him. Paul Robeson was a huge football star. He was billed as the greatest defensive end in the history of football. But he was still faced with abuse on the field from the opposing teams. Football itself is really hard on the body, and then you add in racism-fueled attacks on top of it, and Paul's body was really taking on a lot. Paul finished law school at Columbia in early 1923 at the age of 24. The time had come where he had to make a decision about the direction of his life. Did he want to have a career in law, or did he want to be an actor? He had to put every ounce of his energy into one, so he would have to choose. And it was a really, really difficult decision for him to make. His decision may surprise you because we are here talking about Paul Robeson because he was an entertainer, right? Well, in February of 1923, he chose to prepare for the New York State Bar exam and seek a position in a Wall Street law firm. And he did just that. But despite all of his great accomplishments to become a lawyer as a black man in 1923, there was still the fact that he was a black man in 1923. And people within his law firm treated him as you'd expect. Even a young secretary who he had kindly asked to transcribe a legal document for him announced coldly that she, quote, will never take dictation from it, N-word. Sorry, I cannot say that word. And she stormed out of the room. Clients refused to have him represent them, judges flat out discriminated against him in the courtroom, and his colleagues were harsh to him on a daily basis. But the senior partners knew they had a great asset in Paul Robeson, so they set up a branch office in Harlem for him to head. This was incredibly generous and a great solution to the difficulties in the white-dominated Maine firm, but Paul declined. He knew that a career in law would be forever held back by race. He would always be limited by racial prejudice. It was a difficult decision to make, but he knew it was the best decision for his future. The entertainment world wouldn't exactly be a walk in the park, but he was willing to give up his future in law to give it a shot. And it was worth it. Paul Robeson joined the Provincetown Players and was instantly beloved by audiences and critics alike. Essie became Paul's manager, and she quickly secured him a film role in one of famed Black director Oscar Michaud's films, Body and Soul. And the money was great. All throughout this journey, law school, the theater, films, Paul was singing. He would sing at parties, events, at church, and eventually concerts. He had a deep, stunning singing voice. He loved the freedom of artistic expression as a singer. Man, this guy just had so many talents. Paul, with Essie's help as his keen manager, was quickly pretty famous, especially in Europe. And he was on his way to becoming pretty wealthy. He and Essie were highly involved in Harlem society and were climbing the social ranks both there and in London when they returned there. Paul's fame continued to rise, and he eventually spent most of his time in London. He was a classical concert vocalist, and even some talk down the road of him tackling the opera. He was very good and very popular amongst his sophisticated audiences. It seemed like he had made a sound decision in leaving a challenging career in law behind to pursue a life in entertainment. Paul and Essie's marriage had always been strong on a business front, but it wasn't the most solid relationship on a deep emotional level. Remember, Paul had really wanted to marry Jerry, and he never really got over her. And by 1926, 5 years into their marriage, Paul was having affairs. Most notably with fellow Black actress Freddie Washington, an affair that lasted for more than 20 years. But Paul and Essie held on, both for their own codependent reasons. And then in the spring of 1927, for different reasons. Essie was expecting a baby. Little Paul Robeson Jr. was born on November 2nd, 1927. Well, maybe not so little. He was over 11 pounds when he was born. Paul was in Europe on a singing engagement when his son was born, and he didn't return home until he received word that Essie was extremely ill from a series of postnatal complications. Paul Robeson Jr. wrote the book I used for my primary source, and he said his grandmother, Essie's mother, was his caretaker from the moment he was born and remained his primary caretaker for most of his childhood. He never really had a close relationship with his father. They called him Small Paul. Isn't that cute? It took Essie several months to recover from giving birth. Once she was back to normal, she and Paul returned to England so he could pick back up on his successful European career, both singing and acting, but mostly singing. He sang to sold-out venues all over Europe, and he sang for the royal families of England, Greece, Romania, and Yugoslavia. When Small Paul was just under 2 years old, he and Essie's mother joined them in Europe. Things were good in England. The couple was able to purchase a mansion in London, but Small Paul and his grandmother would primarily reside in Switzerland and Moscow. Paul and Essie would continue to go back and forth between London and the States, spending most of their time in London. Paul was having pretty regular affairs, and Essie knew about some of them. And with each woman she discovered, the more resentful she grew. I mean, can you blame her? Well, she came to a boiling point and decided to get even in a pretty intense way. She wrote a tell-all book about Paul's life. But this act did not signal the end of the marriage. Paul received it as this, according to their son's book. Quote, Essie's book was her way of publicly defending what she felt were irrevocable rights as Mrs. Robeson. Paul now read it as an unmistakable warning to him. If you even think of replacing me as Mrs. Paul Robeson, beware of my wrath. You can't even imagine what I will do to you, but here's a little taste of it." End quote. He knew this was Essie's intention, but the book was the true beginning of the decline of the marriage in Paul's mind at the time. Plus, he really wanted to marry his lover Yolanda, a white woman. But it's really hard to walk away from a relationship, and Paul did love Essie. But he also loved having physical and emotional affairs with other women. They separated, they reunited, then they separated, and then they reunited, and did that on repeat for quite a while. They had a connection they just couldn't quite seem to sever. Even after they began divorce proceedings in 1932, they kept coming back to each other. In the end, Paul ended his relationship with Yolanda, and he and Essie decided to remain married until death do they part. But their marriage would be different now. They agreed to an open marriage. Each of them could have affairs as long as they were discreet and did not cause any public stir. And Essie would no longer have a part in Paul's career. Well, that lasted for a little while, but Paul eventually realized he needed her keen negotiating skills. Paul and Essie's son included tons of letters and diary entries in his book, and I can tell you with most certainty that this is not the arrangement that Essie wanted. It definitely benefited Paul. He was free of her control and could still go out and have all of the fun he wanted with other women while still having the comfort of her at home. But Essie wanted true, devoted love from him. But if this was the best he could give her, she would accept that. Paul Robeson hit the big screen again once talkies were well rounded out. He appeared in one film for United Artists in Queens, and then he returned to London to pursue films there. He took on a project that he was really proud of, a film called Sanders of the River, which went on to be a huge hit. And he really dove into African language and culture as he prepared for the film. 400 Black people from Africa were involved in the production. Can you imagine that in Hollywood in 1934? Well, Paul gained a lot of cultural enrichment from his time befriending his new African friends and learning everything he could about their cultures and history, and their struggles with colonization of the British colonies. Paul had been swimming in politics and civil rights advocacy during his time in Harlem and in London. His social circles were rich with hours and hours of these discussions, and Paul was constantly urged to become involved. But he was a pretty reserved man, and he did not like confrontations. And there are a lot of confrontations involved in politics and advocacy. He had his political views, strong ones, but he preferred to remain quiet. But the more educated he became in different cultures and their different struggles, the more difficult it was for him to keep his voice suppressed. It was actually a trip to Moscow that really changed the way he viewed the world around him. Because in Russia, color didn't matter at all. Blacks and whites were truly equal, and it was the most marvelous thing he'd ever experienced. It was pretty good in London, definitely not good in America, but so liberating in the Soviet Union. He loved his visits to Moscow, which, as you can imagine, became quite controversial back in the U.S. Down the road, when he was being questioned by the U.S. House Un-American Activities Committee in 1956, they asked him why he hadn't just moved to Russia. This was his reply to them, quote, "Because my father was a slave and my people died to build this country. And I'm going to stay right here and have a part of it, just like you. And no fascist-minded people will drive me from it. Is that clear? I am for peace with the Soviet Union, and I am for peace with China. And I am not for peace or friendship with fascist Franco. And I am not for peace with fascist Nazi Germans. I am for peace with decent people." End quote. Back to the 1930s. It's finally time for Hollywood. But Paul wasn't really too interested in a life or career in Hollywood. Yes, that's what many performers strive for, but Paul was a true artist in his work. He dug deep into cultures and emotions as he prepared for both his vocal work and his acting roles, and he knew that wasn't a priority in Hollywood. So he agreed to appear in the 1936 Universal Studios film Showboat, a show that he had tackled to perfection on the stage in London. Showboat has been done a million times, yet the song Old Man River will always be Paul Robeson's. Hattie McDaniel, who'd also done Showboat on stage, was also cast with Paul in the film. Paul wasn't afraid to speak up in Hollywood. He was accustomed to being a huge star in Europe and having the equality, for the most part, to back that. He wanted to have some creative control over his performance in Showboat, and he also just simply wasn't going to be told what to do. When he told the studio exec that he had to get back to London for a performance at Royal Albert Hall that would kick off his next European tour, the exec said, "What's that? We'll buy Albert Hall." Yeah, good luck with that, sir. Paul's performance in Showboat was a hit, and more Hollywood directors and studio execs wanted what he had to offer. But the cool thing about Paul Robeson was that he wasn't afraid to say no. He carefully curated his career to fit his artistic vision. I should say Essie, she was the real rock star behind his business dealings. And this really took Hollywood by surprise. Although Paul was insanely famous in Europe, he was a newbie to Hollywood. Who was this new guy waltzing into the land of dreams and saying no? Who does that? Paul Robeson does. He knew he could secure prominent roles in films as a black man in England, but definitely not in Hollywood. While back in LA on a concert tour in 1940, Paul got to experience some of that ugly racial injustice that he was spared from in England and most of Europe. The only hotel in Los Angeles that was willing to accommodate him was the Beverly Wilshire Hotel, which was and still is a very nice hotel. But still, there were conditions. He was charged a much higher rate than the white guests, and they required that he stay under an assumed name. So what did Paul Robeson do? Do you think he hid out in his room under a secret identity so nobody would actually see that a black man was staying amongst them? Absolutely not. He scheduled 2 hours every single day of his visit to sit in the lobby of the hotel, amongst the white guests. He made a statement, and soon after that, black guests were more welcomed. Paul had starred in Shakespeare's Othello in London in 1930, and in 1943, he returned to New York to reprise the role on Broadway. This would be the longest run to that point that a Shakespearean production had run on Broadway, 280 performances. And Paul Robeson was only the second black man to play the role, and the first black man to play alongside an otherwise white cast. The end of World War II in 1945 was a turning point in Paul's career. From this point, he only performed artistically in support of political causes in which he believed. He used his powerful voice to rise up to the platforms he thought needed a strong voice. Now, that voice was accepted well in Europe, and people listened. But back in the US, there were many people who did not want to listen. You know, racism. When Paul arrived in Peekskill, New York to sing, it was a downright dangerous situation. Not only for him, but for the people who chose to come and hear him sing. The ugliness of racism really showed at this event. Several hundred protesters were there threatening Robeson and his audience. So a band of fans from the audience created a physical human fence surrounding the audience and their star, Paul Robeson. They put their lives in harm's way. It was a really beautiful act of love, respect, and humanity. In the end, 145 concertgoers were injured as the result of mob attacks after the concert ended. Police did nothing to stop the violence. Can you see why Paul Robeson preferred to spend his time in Europe and Russia? Following the Peekskill incident, other U.S. concerts were canceled in fear of a similar event. Rutgers removed him from their history. He was their star football player, and he was erased as if he'd never existed there. Racism wins again. But this only made Paul's voice louder. In 1950, the United States Secretary of State canceled Paul's passport, stating, quote, "This action is taken because the department considers that Paul Robeson's travel abroad would be contrary to the best interests of the United States," end quote. Does that make sense to you? Because it doesn't to me. What I gather from this is Paul Robeson was not welcome in very many places in the United States of America, but the United States of America forbade him from leaving the United States of America to go somewhere where he was welcome. Okay then. What it came down to is that he was labeled a communist because of his ties with the Soviet Union, and the US government wanted to control his voice and where he was allowed to speak it. Writer and friend Lloyd Brown said of this time in American history, quote, "Paul Robeson was the most persecuted, the most ostracized, the most condemned black man in America, then or ever," end quote. So now that Paul Robeson was stuck in the grand land of racism, he put all of his energy into fighting against it. I want to share an excerpt from an interview I saw of Paul Robeson outside of the United States Court of Appeals during this time because I think it really sums up his civil rights activism well. Quote, "Most importantly are the questions raised by the State Department as to my political opinions. There is a question of whether one wants to sing, act, and have as a citizen political opinions. And in attacking me, they suggested that when I was abroad, that I spoke out about the injustices to the Negro people in the United States. I certainly did. And the Supreme Court Justice just ruled, Judge Warren in the segregation cases, that world opinion have a lot to do with that ruling, that our Negro children can go to school like anybody else in the South. And I'm very proud to have been a part of directing world opinion to precisely that condition," end quote. Because of his radical voice, Paul Robeson was barred from theaters, concert venues, and movie studios in the United States. Nobody wanted to be associated with him. The British would have loved him back, but he wasn't permitted to leave the United States. The Canadians loved him. They loved him so much that on May 8, 1952, they gathered at the Canadian-US border in Surrey, British Columbia, and listened to the voice of Paul Robeson sing from just over the international border in Blaine, Washington. 35,000 Canadian residents gathered at their border to hear the voice of Paul Robeson. He performed live from the United States to an audience in Canada. Isn't that both incredibly sad and beautiful at the same time? In 1958, the U.S. Supreme Court finally came to their senses and decided to follow their own law in the issue of Paul Robeson's passport. They ruled that the State Department had no right under the law to deny a U.S. passport because of a person's political beliefs and associations. This nearly decade-long fight had taken a serious toll on Paul Robeson's European career success, and also his mental and physical health. He essentially sacrificed 9 years of his life to fight for American civil rights, as a prisoner of the country who didn't allow him equal rights or even admittance into many public areas. He fought for his people and for the future. With his renewed passport in hand, Paul was joyfully welcomed back to England, but he had just lost so much spark in his almost 10-year fight with the U.S. His mental health had really suffered at the hands of all of the government oppression, and in 1961, Paul attempted suicide. Paul and Essie stayed in London for 5 years and then returned to the U.S. in 1963. Essie Robeson passed away 2 years later in 1965. After Essie's death, Paul moved in with his sister where he lived a mostly private life. Paul Robeson suffered a stroke and died on January 23, 1976. He was 77 years old. And now I would like to share some other interesting things I learned during my research. Bullet point number 1. During his early days in Harlem, Paul posed nude for sculptor Antonio Salem and photographer Nicholas Murray. I saw a couple of these photos and woo-wee, H-O-T-T. Bullet point number 2. Paul Robeson was considered as a vice presidential candidate on Henry Wallace's Progressive Party ticket in 1948. How cool would that have been? Of course, this was in the midst of Paul's civil rights controversy in the U.S., so I'm sure it would have turned very ugly. Bullet point number 3. There is an heirloom tomato variety that originated in Russia that is named after Paul Robeson. Why a tomato? Well, I obviously had to know. According to the Fruition Seed Company, the Paul Robeson heirloom is, quote, distinctly sweet with an incredible depth, often described as smooth smokiness, end quote. Like the voice of Paul Robeson. Well, that just sounds absolutely delicious. I must find a Paul Robeson tomato. Bullet point number 4. I found Paul and Essie's grand English estate online, and it is everything you would dream it to be. It is a beautifully English 6-bedroom Victorian mansion that was last on the market for £6 million in 2014. I believe they also had a smaller home in London as well. This estate was in Hampstead. Bullet point number 5. Paul Robeson's contributions to college athletics was finally recognized in 1995. More than 75 years after graduating as valedictorian from Rutgers, his athleticism was finally preserved and recognized as he was posthumously entered into the College Football Hall of Fame. In conclusion, Paul Robeson was a highly intelligent and deeply cultured man who possessed many artistic talents. When he did something, he did it to perfection. He was a great student of the law, he was the best football player in the nation, he was a highly sought-after singer, he was a deep artistic actor, and he was a passionate social activist. He dug deep into many cultures around the world, and he embodied the cultures that he visited and learned from. He was a true student of the world. He learned over 25 different languages, and he sang folk songs to the people in their native language. 25! I know 1.5 languages. He did this out of a love of learning and out of pure respect. Do you want to know just how powerful his voice was? On January 27, 1938, Paul Robeson performed on the front lines of a war zone in Spain during the Spanish Civil War. When he sang, the shooting stopped. His voice caused a war to stand still. As his voice spilled out over speakers, enemies stopped killing each other to listen to a man sing. Paul Robeson fought through racial unfairness and hostility from the moment he stepped onto the Rutgers campus as a teenage boy. He was highly accomplished, yet he was treated like dirt. Yet he fought on. He fought through it all. He was not going to surrender. He lost his mother so young and so tragically. She never had a chance to raise her youngest child and help mold him into a solid, respectable man. But boy, I bet she was sure proud looking down on her little boy and all of his strengths and accomplishments. He was a remarkable man. Thank you, Paul Robeson, for being the voice of equal rights, even though you wanted to keep your political beliefs quiet. You were forced to sacrifice your career and your life in London at the height of your success because of extreme racism and inequality in your home country. And you took that horrible experience and turned it into an opportunity to share your voice, to speak on behalf of all of the other people wronged. That's pretty amazing. Thank you. And thank you all for listening. I have a ton of great legends on my list for future episodes, but if you have any requests, please shoot me an email at goldenagestars@gmail.com. Or you can message me on Facebook or Instagram on the Stars of the Golden Age page, and I'll get your request scooted up to the top of that list. If you would like to receive bonus material in exchange for a little support to the show, head on over to patreon.com/Stars of the Golden Age podcast to learn all about the different tiers of support and what kind of perks come with them. And as always, it helps a ton if you could take a second to leave a rating and review where you listen to your podcasts. I am so grateful to have you all listening, but would love to have more people join us in our stories, and ratings and reviews really help new people discover the show. Share away with your friends too, if you think they'd be interested in this topic. My primary source for this episode was a book titled The Undiscovered Paul Robeson, An Artist's Journey by Paul Robeson Jr. I also watched a documentary titled Paul Robeson, Tribute to an Artist, narrated by Sidney Portier. An article from PBS from August 26, 2006, goldenglobes.com, picturingblackhistory.org, and IMDB.